Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside Events, a international podcast focused on contemporary issues and concepts in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. John Welty-Peachy, who's the Dean at Gordon College. And we're going to be talking about sport for development. Hi, John.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
First question, really, just to kind of kick things off. Who are you? What's your role and the organisation that you work for? And why are you and why have you been for quite a bit of time now interested in sport for development?
Great, thanks. And good to be with everybody. And I am at Gordon College. I am Dean of Academic Affairs here and Professor of Sport Management and Leadership. As of about 7 months ago, transitioned from the University of Illinois, where I was for about 10 years. So I've come over into the dark side of administration, if you will, going well. But I've been involved in the sport for development space for probably about 25 years, first as a practitioner, and then that really stimulated my interest in research in the sport for development space and events, which I'll be talking about some today. And I think that was really generated from my upbringing. I had parents who were very socially conscious, very focused on social justice issues, on peace building issues, conflict resolution. So I had that in my background. And then I was an athlete and competed in running and cycling for a long time, and was always looking for ways to sort of bridge that interest of sports and athletics and my interest in peace building and social justice. And this was before sport for development was even a thing, before we even had coined that phrase really. So I was interested in that and started to think about ways that we could merge those. And after graduating college, did a very stupid thing with a friend, which was ran across the United States of America. Did a 4,000-mile run to raise money for various homeless agencies. So trying to leverage the role of sports, in this case running, to get into communities to showcase supply of the homeless and to raise funds for that. So I was kind of doing sport for development before I kind of really knew what it was back when I was a young kid. And then through my graduate work, I got an internship with the Institute for International Sport in Rhode Island and began to work in that space, planning events, running different events, became involved with Street Soccer USA and the Homeless World Cup and the Street Soccer USA Cup, and just started to parlay my practical work in the field into my research interests. So it was kind of a merge between that, and I guess I've been in that space ever since, for the last 20 years or so.
That's really interesting, and it's kind of actually quite rare to hear an academic kind of coming from it from a practical perspective, living and breathing it, even bringing it into the familial kind of environment as well, and to have that at the kind of almost kind of like the heart of what you do. You always kind of, a lot of the time you see academics kind of tackling issues and ideas that not necessarily they've been directly linked to at all. So that must mean, does that mean that you are, does that motivate you a lot on a day-to-day basis to kind of to push and do this in your academic work?
Right, called kind of a pracademic, if you will. So I think really what it did when, in terms of my research, it really informed the research questions, right? Because of the experience of living it, of seeing the challenges and what organizations face who are working in this space, living that, kind of breathing that. It kind of really stimulated what I was interested in, which really started to narrowing in on how can we best design these events or design these programs? What are the component parts that can possibly bring about positive outcomes? It really depends on how we do that design of those events and programs. And so I really became interested in sort of that managerial aspects of sport for development. But that really just, as you said, might have flowed out of the practical work I was doing.
And bringing kind of academics closer to the empirical phenomenon or the problem or the issue. You always see that that's a magical space, that if we can do that more, then we'll create more relevant and interesting and practically applicable research in lots of different ways. And for those that are kind of unaware of the concept of sport for development, might be students at the very beginning of their program, or it might just be kind of people who are in the field doing sport for development, which I'm sure a lot of people would now listen to this concept and go, well, I've been doing sport for development for some time, but I never even called it that. How would you, for the listeners, break that concept down just so it's easily understandable?
That's a great question. And as I was referring to, I think probably a lot of folks have been doing it like I was and didn't even know that they were doing it. So this is our academic jargon when we talk about sport for development and peace. However we use to define it, which is really about looking at how sport and even recreation and play can be used to evince some positive outcomes in society, whether it's at the individual level, community level, societal level, by things like enhancing social inclusion, by decreasing prejudice between people that just don't know each other, between working at issues of conflict resolution, between bettering health outcomes in a community or society, to raising one's individual self-esteem, let's say, or feelings of inclusion, to building sense of community amongst a particular area. So or even some economic development. So when we think about sport for development and peace, if you add that on, it's really quite broad. So we're really looking at potentially a number of outcomes that sport can bring about. But I say potentially because we need to be careful in thinking that sport can magically do all these things. And that was a criticism of the field for a long time, which was this sort of evangelical notion that sport was all powerful, that everybody loves sport, right? Sport can do all these great things. And we have a tendency to think that way. I think sometimes, for us, it's been so meaningful when we were athletes or we were involved in it. We think, well, of course, sport is like magic pill. It can do all these great things, but in reality, it can't. And in some instances, it might not even be the best form of development, because there's been folks working in the development space for years and years and years, not using sport, that are doing very, very good work. So when we think about the concept, we also want to be careful to assume that sport is this magic pill and can address these outcomes better than any other development mechanism. So we don't want to think that that's the case. And that's the evangelical rhetoric that has sometimes been out there. Now, that's getting better. I think we're learning more about how we go about this and how sport can be packaged with other development mechanisms to create a portfolio, say for a community or for an agency that's working in development. So it can reach many people, but maybe not all people. So I think that's the message, is what sport for development is it's a good tool, but it's not always probably the best tool for all instances, for all people. So, we have to figure that out, when is that really good for? But it really depends on if we're just sort of learning about that concept, how we design and manage it. So if we're thinking of events or a program, I use the concept of, well, let's say you're working at conflict resolution between, let's say, Israelis and Palestinians, and you want to use football or soccer to do that. If you bring youth from those communities together and just throw out the soccer ball on the pitch and say, go play, is that going to do it? Right? Is that going to work at those issues of conflict resolution? I suspect not. Because we haven't thought about structure, we haven't thought about instructors who are trained in conflict mediation, we haven't put thought into the design. So just throwing it out there and assuming that, we're going to play and work out our differences is going to do it, that's the furthest thing from the truth. So I think another message, if we're just learning about the concept, is it does depend. The outcomes, the potential positive outcomes depend on how we do it, on how we design it, how we implement it, the people involved, the relationships that are built between the coaches and instructors and the participants in the event, in the program. And really, what we found in our research is that's almost the most important thing, is those relationships. So if you have an event, if you have a program, it really matters who is delivering it, who are the coaches, who are the volunteers, who are the instructors, who are the staff. because they really represent what the participants in the programs are going to be learning and learning from. So really, that's another, I think, key message is just realizing that our staffing structure really impacts those outcomes as well. So that's, I think, if we're just learning about sport for development, that's another really important thing to understand. And then maybe lastly, I would just say that we're starting to look a lot more into the role of events. And we'll talk about more about events, and we're starting to push out this concept of events for development. So whether they're one-off events or events that are tied closely into ongoing programming that a community has, but how can events help potentially to bring about these positive outcomes, whether at the individual level or the community level or the societal level? So it's sort of this concept of leverage, or how do we strategically design and plan with our outcomes in mind. And so if we're running a sport for development or sport for development peace event, and we want to target the outcome, let's say, of cross-cultural tolerance or acceptance between communities that are historically in conflict, we need to plan for that. So what are some of the component parts that we're going to use to get to that? So I think that's, bottom line is the key message for doing these programs is we just don't do it willy-nilly, but we need to strategically think about how we put that together. And I think that's where we're still doing a lot of research is what exactly are those component parts? What do we need in order to bring about this outcome or that outcome? And how does that differ based upon the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And so those would be some starting points for folks to...
That was really, really comprehensive, certainly for kind of people just starting out, kind of thinking about that concept. I was going to say that there is always this naturalized assumption that events and sports are that panacea, that they just naturally happen without some sort of intervention. But as Danny O'Brien says, they are merely the seed capital, and it's what you do with it that matters the most, and the kind of things that you put together and who's in the room. Right. You can develop as much as you want, but are you developing the right direction? Are you developing with the right people? Are the right people in the room? Who's the development for? Those kind of questions of social justice now are becoming increasingly embedded, aren't they, in events and sports for development? And we're seeing kind of bidding criteria, evaluation criteria for getting these large-scale events in particular focused a lot more on social responsibility and whether it's the sort of right sort of development. Because I guess the concept in and of itself does not say whether it's good or bad development. It's just saying development. In lots of ways.
And how we do it.
Yeah. So in terms of why events are so powerful, John, for sport for development or events for development, why do you think, what makes them such powerful mechanisms for social change in that sense?
That's a really good question, Mike. And I think there's maybe a couple of aspects here that I think it bears further thinking about too, conceptually, empirically. Events are visible, and they are ways that people can connect to an issue. So if we had an event, it's something that perhaps media is going to cover, that's visible in the community, that can call to light the particular issue that is at play, and that can stimulate awareness amongst the general population or the community. An event I've done a lot of work with is the Street Soccer USA, which is an organization that uses soccer to try to help individuals recover from homelessness. And so they have teams in various cities in the United States, and then they run a Street Soccer USA Cup. And it's been held in various cities, got its start in Washington, D.C. It's been held in Times Square, in other places. And we've done some research with that. And it's all part of this Homeless World Cup series. But it's an event that highlights really the issues of homelessness in the United States. And so we have that. It's an opportunity to call attention to it. So events provide that opportunity for people to visibly see, if you will, the issue at hand, and to experience it, and to be there, and to even interact with people who might be marginalized or who might be part of a community that we're trying to heal or we're trying to help in some way. So events create that space, that visible space that we have. And we think about sport events in particular. Sport, it's a universal language in many ways, and every country culture has sport, some derivation of that, and has events that revolve around that. So it's that universal language as well that people connect to and have some passion about. And it can help to strengthen communities. So, but it's really critical when we think about events, though, that we don't want to think of them as just, oh, we do this event in the community and then all these positive things are going to happen long term. So we have to be careful about that. So if we're running events, let's say events for development, it is more effective if it's just not a one-off or an event that just happens once, but that these events are packaged within the ongoing program suite that's taking place in the community. So if there's programs that are ongoing, whatever those might be, that the event can kind of be this focal point, as I was saying, that draws attention to the issue. But let's say that folks taking part in the event who are the population we're trying to help, it's just not the event they're doing, but they're also taking part in year-round programming. And the event kind of is packaged within that ongoing portfolio of programs. And that's really critical when we think about the role of events, that it's just not, oh, we're just going to do this event, and then we don't think about it, how that's really networked into what the community is doing.
And John, do we think about, do we do that well?
No, we don't
do that. We don't do that well, do we?
We don't do that well. I mean, I think there's organizations that are beginning to do that well. I can think of this Point to the Street Soccer organization that through the work that we're doing with them to really help thinking about strategically how we place that within our ongoing portfolio of events. But that's a real aspect for growth, Mike, is doing that better and developing the partnerships that we need for that to happen. Events run on partnerships, as we know, and those ongoing partnerships are very important. So events have potential, but I don't think we're activating them for development as best we could. And by events, we can shape it as, from small scale, 5K runs or smaller events to more mid-size or even potentially mega events or larger events if we're thinking strategically about that. So a lot really depends on how we're connecting outside of that event. And I think that's where we fall down a little bit.
I think the events industry, I don't know about America so well, but I can definitely speak for the UK, which is that they tend to be incredibly isolated things. And they tend to not only be cities within cities, they come in and they just kind of almost are completely divorced from the context that they're in sometimes. That might be a marathon. It just comes in, it plonks itself down and cuts up all the roads and then it just disappears. And then you don't hear anything else from it ever again. But then I think, who is responsible for stitching it together? That's a really hard question, isn't it? Because you've got the event manager that's responsible for making it happen, and then you've got the local authority. But people in local authorities are constantly changing, and there just doesn't ever seem like there is that grouping of people that have enough of a long-term stake in the destination to think more strategically and to understand really the nuance of what's going on. Do you agree or disagree, or partly disagree or agree, or what do you think?
I agree it's very challenging, and I think some of the things that we've written about is we almost need a leveraging task force or a group that's put together comprised of various stakeholders for the exact purpose of, when we say leverage, we're really meaning strategically thinking about connecting the design, connecting the event to the outcomes and planning for that rather than just running the event and hoping that the outcomes are going to come about. But that we create some body of folks that represent the various partners. because that's a real challenge. And it can't just be, let's say, we say SFD, Sport for Development, it just can't be, say, an SFD organization that has that entire responsibility, because that's hard. And they don't have the resources often or the connections to do that. So that's one of the things that we've suggested is thinking about creating some type of group that then owns that responsibility, with committed stakeholders. But to your point, Mike, very, very, very difficult.
Yeah,
For it
yeah,
to happen. Yeah,
completely.
to make that connection happen long term. And when we think about marginalized folks, I mean, that's really what they need. And that's one of the areas that we really need to look at too with research is outcomes. What span do we measure those on? So let's say we do an event and we do some pre-post work and we see that somebody's attitude or behavior has changed as a result of this program or event. That's rather short term, let's say a week or two. And so that's good. That's great. Self-esteem or feeling more included or aware of other people's cultures or decrease in prejudice, whatever it is that we're measuring. But we're really interested in long-term change. We're really interested in what happens 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. And is this sustainable? And I think we've not done that well. We've not taken that yet. So in terms of a future growth opportunity, and really looked at the outcomes of, say, events and programs really over that long term. We're getting better at that because we have researchers now who've been involved in sport for development for a longer time. And it's something that we've all talked about is we need more longitudinal research. But even packaging events in there, and how can we extend that research to show potential impact of events even after a year or 5 years? So what connection points do the event organizers continue with the participants? How do they continue to build on, let's say, what was learned? If we bring 500 youth together to learn about something and we're using a certain sport as a mechanism for that, then what's happening after that event's done? How are we maintaining those connections? And then activating some research that's exploring that as well. So those would be some challenges, but also some opportunities in the events for development space too, Mike.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, John. And a central question that I've always been interested in, and we just recently wrote a paper about it with Milena Parent and Joan Carlini in the Gold Coast, which is, why is it that local interests are so central and celebrated at the very beginning of particularly large-scale events, major events I'm talking about? Why do they become deprioritized over time toward the live staging and then almost kind of forgotten about? And we argue that they, central, marginal stakeholder interests, you could argue that they're not actually a stakeholder whatsoever at all, because they don't actually possess any of the features that make them a stakeholder by the time the actual event comes round. So they kind of get deprioritized over that time. And one of the things that we mentioned is that there aren't these people come and go all the time in destinations that legitimize or give power to marginal interests. And these just fluctuate so much, and particularly in a large-scale event, because it's such a protracted period, you just kind of get a fall-off. The people that were, the Labour Party in the UK for London 2012 said, I think it was roughly about 40% of social housing was going to be earmarked for London, and then the Tories come in, and then suddenly it's like 12%. And it's just, we just kind of allow this natural fall-off of interests. And I can imagine, certainly for a major event or a mega event, that undermines the absolute power of mega events for development. Would you agree, John?
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah, I think at that level, for when we're thinking about mega events, that would be the case, and maybe even at smaller events too, because there's so many stakeholders with vested interests in there, and our organizations will come into communities doing better at this, and we've often said helicoptering in and doing an event or two or a program, and then helicoptering out, and then we've maybe fulfilled our funders' priorities, or we've fulfilled our priorities, but the local stakeholders have been marginalized in that, because it's like, now what?
Mm, mm, mm.
What do we do after that? Where do we
That's
go
so
from
true.
here? Now we're definitely getting better with that,
Mm.
to create that local ownership, and not that marginalization. But I think even to your point, even with smaller events, I think some of that could be experienced as well.
Completely. I've felt that too. It didn't matter whether it's a food festival, a light festival, a local marathon. See the same trend. It's a little bit less extreme than an
Right.
extreme case like a mega event, but it's in its micro form in some sense. Joe, we've got probably about 5 minutes left. I was just going to ask you, in terms of the kind of concept, sport for development, where's it come from, and where's it going? Do you think? Like, what are the kind of what's the history of it? Perhaps how has it developed over maybe the last decade, and where's it kind of going to go? Do you think? Some sense.
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. So, if we look at the academic space, I think it really started gaining traction maybe about 20 years ago. And I was kind of in that space, and a number of others who were working there, John Sugden, and a number of others who were beginning to think about this concept and run actual events in programs to try to bring people together to heal or to develop communities. But there's roots that go back even further. When we think about the power of events, let's say, we can trace things back, let's say, even to the ancient Olympic Games, right? That we have a truce between nations, when we compete at the games. Right? But even some concept of bringing people together through events to learn, right, or to participate, to learn to know people from other cultures, countries. So I think there's historical context that goes way on back, really, and that has kind of influenced us. But really, as an academic space, it's been maybe 20 years. I think the last 10 years, it's really gotten traction. When I first really started, which would have been the mid 2000s, I was pretty new in terms of publishing and publishing research in this. And then, boy, now there was a boom. And now we see a lot of research being published in many, many fascinating areas in sport for development. And a lot of folks getting involved from so many disciplines in it as well. I approach it from the managerial and sport management side, but as we know, we have folks involved from sociology, psychology, business, social work, many different anthropology, many different disciplines that are excited about working in this space. So I think it's proliferated in terms of our academic involvement. It's more accepted in our journals. You see, like in your journal, Mike, event management, my field journal, sport management review, and others. You see a lot of published work now in sport development. I think it's only going to increase. I think we got to keep thinking about what are the new edges, within that, to explore. I think events are still one that we can tease out more. How we best design those, how we best roll those out, and what are the long-term impacts of those. Looking at hybrid organizations or hybridity organizations that are for-profit, non-profit, or adopting some revenue generation techniques, as well as serving a particular population that we're trying to help in a positive way. I think we need and will continue to have more theorizing on putting together the conceptual understanding of sport for development and where events, fit into that space. I think we've done some theory work with my colleagues, Nico Schulenkorf and Ramon Spage and others, and
Really good, yeah.
Trying to push out more conceptual understanding. So I think that's going to continue to happen. That's a real challenge. We think, well, can there ever be this universal theory of sport for development? Alexis Liris and I have one from a long time ago, sport for development theory, but we keep picking that apart and trying to test it in various ways. But it's something we wrestle with. But I think that's going to continue. What's unique about sport, right? In this case, what are the aspects of sport that lend itself to development or not? And when it's appropriate. So I think there's still going to be an edge with thinking conceptually, theoretically, as we push that out, and not just borrowing, from other disciplines, but continuing to generate our theory, our concepts from within.
And Joe, I just wanted to kind of just add on that, which is we just wrote something on how over the last 70 years, because it's not just about it's about the type of development, it's kind of when the development happens and being kind of patient in certain sense of development, and so when we look at major and mega events, a lot of the development doesn't happen until a long time kind of down the line, and often it's at an kind of an ontological level that most people don't look at it, which is this paper was focused on 70 years after the Stoke Mandeville Games, and it was looking at the way in which large scale events had changed our thinking on accessibility, inclusivity, disability, and particularly attitudes against and for disabled people. And you can kind of illustrate. We try to illustrate this symbiotic connection between the events, the major events that occur, and the UN movement in this, and the accords on this, and illustrating that actually sport and sport events have been that northern star for these big policy areas, and it necessarily wasn't for these major events. We wouldn't have the birth of kind of the Paralympic Committee or the Paralympic Commission, and then the Invictus Games, and then all of these other sorts of events that have kind of spawned out of the Stoke Mandeville Games back in the 1950s. And so in some sense, you've got the micro stuff that happened right now, and then you've got the stuff that happens in 2, 5, 10. But then you've got, I believe, this big meta view on development, which is that it happens over maybe a decade, 10 decades, an entire century, that something happens. And if it wasn't for so I think we need to be, and I don't know whether you agree, but we need to be a little bit patient in some sense to see the value accruing. Do you agree with that, John, or not?
Yes, yeah, I think so, Mike. And not just at the community level, but even at the individual level too. And now a lot of my research has been at the individual level, but even attitudes take time to change. Behaviors take time to change. So I think patience is true and very key. And also it points to, again, we need to be looking at these events with longer time horizons, even when we're thinking about our research, right? And what claims we're making. So I'd agree 100%. I think we do need that patience. Doesn't always lend itself well to publishing. No, it doesn't. Well, what did we find, right?
Might have a magic pill.
Right. So there is that, right? But yeah, 100%. Yeah, we need to have see how those things play out over time. It's just not easy, quick fixes, and the events don't have that quick fix, and programs don't have that quick fix at the community level or really at the individual level either.
Completely. And like now you've got Japan and Tokyo 2020 that has radically transformed ideas around disabled people, when actually there has been kind of decades and centuries of not including disabled rights, and even seeing them as come antithetical to modern society. So huge change that happens over time. Yeah. John, I would ask you about, we're out of time, but I would ask you just to kind of maybe suggest some kind of resources that we'll put underneath the podcast, that I'll just ask you via email to just send those over, and we can add them underneath the podcast, including some of the work that you've done and colleagues and all around the world. But we'll leave it there. But thank you so much for joining Inside Events. And yeah, hopefully we'll do a follow-up at some point in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, John.